Hey, great to have you here. So today I want to do another SH Figuarts video. I know I recently put out a video talking about the San Diego Comic-Con exclusives and the Dragon Ball line as a whole there. I want to give another topic as far as a relevant discussion here with regards to reissues, and specifically looking at the Dragon Ball line, but looking at SH Figuarts as a whole. There have been a lot of reissues that have taken place over the last couple of years when it comes to Figuarts releases, and I want to list some pros and cons and my thoughts on the impact there as a whole to just the line's future and so forth. So as mentioned, there's been a few examples specifically I would call out when it comes to Figuarts reissues. I know the big one that folks have talked about is the Trunks, Boy from the Future Trunks that came out. He had a lot of issues when it came to his hips being really loose, I think was the main one, but a few other problems that Trunks had. They ultimately came out with a reissue, fixed a lot of the problems. People were really happy with the new release, and I think they wound up putting it near one of their favorite Figuarts releases of all time. So that's an example of a reissue that was done well. There's a few other that have taken place over time. I know Bardock was kind of one where they put out originally and then they reissued him just to provide more copies of him, but they wound up fixing the wrist joint issue that he had. I know Guts, when we talk about Berserk, that separate line, similar situation. When that line came out, I feel like people weren't big fans of the first two releases that came with that, and maybe steered clear of those releases, or they got them and they were disappointed. Apparently they're putting out a new release of that Guts figure. And then why this is relevant more recently is the legendary Super Saiyan Goku that came out that people really loved. Honestly, most people list this as their favorite figure art, Dragon Ball especially, of all time, just because of the posability, the reference to the source material, so forth. The only criticism that he really received was his white chest plate was a different shade than the rest of his body. So it almost looked like he had a tan from a t-shirt that he was wearing, where the rest of his body was a darker tannish color and his chest plate was just a bright white piece. This was really more noticeable for folks doing toy photography and just photo shots in general. Picked it up a little bit more than in person. You would still see it in person, but it was a little bit less of a bother, I would say. But either way, that's an example of a just announced re-release version of that Goku having that fixed. So I wanted to talk about some pros and cons of when they do these reissues and just my thoughts on what reissues do to lines as a whole, especially when they're done frequently. Let's start with the pros, trying to be positive here. So I think it's good for companies to recognize any mistakes and correct them. So if you put this out, you realize, hey, there was a fault with what we put out. We can't really undo having done that decision, but from here on, let's fix that problem and put out new ones that don't have that issue. I think that's a great practice as a whole, just acknowledging there was a problem and addressing it. Building off of that, it shows that you're listening to your fans. So typically these problems arise when the release comes out. People publicly share their thoughts on problems they experience with their figures, and those obviously get back to Tamashii and Bandai, and they wind up correcting those. So definitely kudos to them as far as listening to the fan base, providing relevant responses to what the fans ultimately want. And then finally, when it comes to pros, newcomers to the hobby, if you're joining the line mid, obviously Dragon Ball is a relatively mature franchise at this point when it comes to the SH Figuarts line. It's hard to get caught up as far as you want to collect everything, but you're jumping in fresh. You want to get an optimal figure when you join. So regardless of where you start, you want your first figures to be great releases. So by fixing them and doing reissues, as a new member to the hobby, you're able to pick up a quality figure, which is ultimately awesome, and I think is what we really want to experience as fans, and we want for our fellow fans as far as supporting the line as well. Now let's get into a bit of the cons though. I think there are some issues, not with doing reissues, but with reissues being a recurring problem and being just a frequent thing that's going on with specifically the Dragon Ball line, as I mentioned. So you have your dedicated collectors in your fan base who maybe some of them are completionists. They're going to buy every figure. At the very least, they're going to buy figures when they come out. And those folks already bought the originals of all these figures. They bought the original Trunks. They bought the original Goku, so forth. Those people aren't able to get their situation addressed. I kind of relate this situation to when video game developers rush out a game and they either have a day one patch or they wind up getting a patch some point throughout the development or the release of the game. They're able to do that in a virtual world where you're having a digital asset and improving the experience for everybody. If you bought the game day one, you get the patch, you're fixed. If you bought the game a month into it being released, you get that patch, you you get the good experience. That works for that setting. When it comes to physical items, it doesn't work as well. You have the original that you bought, and you can't just put a patch out to make that figure suddenly better. So that is a problem, I think, when it comes to reissuing or trying the kind of games as a service model in other areas of life when it comes to a physical item. You can't just fix it without manually intervening with that specific customer and that specific product that they purchase. So that's ultimately a problem. I would say, building off of that too, if you bought one previously and they come out with a reissue fixing the problem, obviously you're psyched for everyone who gets the new figure and you're happy that it's going forward a better situation. But why should you then have to buy another one to get the same experience? You already spent your whatever, $70, whatever it was on the original release, and you have that figure now. Why should you have to spend another $70 to get what you intended to buy originally? So that's probably building off of the dedicated fan base and just feeling like you got a little bit slighted by jumping in and supporting the line as quickly as possible. Another thing I would say, upon buying the reissue, so when somebody buys a reissue that's come out ultimately, and they're buying it online typically these days, and they buy the figure, how do they know they're getting the reissue? They obviously want the optimal form of the figure, and companies want to be pushing products, so they're not necessarily as concerned with which version of the figure they're putting out there. They honestly, they may even want to push out the old ones because kind of first in, first out situation. But for folks buying online, how do you know you're getting the reissue? If you see it in person, you can typically tell. You're not going to have the QC problems. Sometimes reissues were going to happen after there's been changes to the box, so you may have a smaller sticker. Those are ways to know. You can see other releases on the back as well. Sometimes places will put on the website reissue in parentheses. They make it a little bit easier for you to figure out, but not everyone does that. So when you're a new buyer or you're somebody who held off and you want to buy the reissue, how do you know you're getting the reissue? That's ultimately a problem, especially if the timeline of original release and reissue are relatively close together, because inventory could be mixed at that point and you may not be sure what you're purchasing. So that's a problem I would call out. And then I would also, as not to be negative necessarily, but digging into the QC and how effective their quality control is. So if a figure is released and then the fans notice, hey, there's a problem with the hip, or there's a problem with the wrist joint, there's a problem somewhere on the figure, needing to get that fan feedback before you notice the problem is a problem in itself. I believe you should have your own internal testing that prevents that from ultimately happening, and you shouldn't necessarily need the public to validate that the flaws took place. I don't know if this is a timeline crunch. It ultimately could be. Obviously, they want to get these things in and out pretty quickly. They want to get you pre-ordering it and ultimately moving on to the next figure as quickly as possible. So I get that when it comes to supply chain and just putting things out in a timely manner, you want to be effective in satisfying the customer, but I probably can speak for a lot of fans in saying we would prefer you to wait a month or two and not have to do this whole reissue debacle. So when it comes to a business, it's hard for them to see it that way all the time. They want to drive revenue and so forth. So I would stress that this is a concern when it comes to just the quality control as a whole. When it comes to the original release, why did they have that problem? I understand every once in a while that happens, but it seems like this is becoming more and more of a problem. And then probably the biggest fear is if you know there's a major QC issue, or even if you don't, why would you buy a figure at release? So if you heard that the trunks has a QC issue, you're probably going to wait to buy it, or you're not going to buy it at all. And that ultimately leads to the line not seeming like it's as strong, but that message gets a little twisted. Obviously, it's a little complicated with premium Bandai because you have pre-orders, so a lot of times you have to decide if you want to buy it before you can see what the figure is in hand for other folks. But I think that may just lead to people skipping pre-orders from premium Bandai, which is also not what we want. When you don't order something because of the fact that there's a QC issue, or if there's not a QC issue and you're just afraid there could be, that sends a signal to the creators that this is not a character or a line that you want to support, but that's not the message you're intending to send. You're intending to send the message, I'm not sure how great this figure is going to be. I really enjoy this character, I enjoy this line, but I want to be conscientious with my money and spend it in a way that seems beneficial. And if there's going to be a problem, I want to know about it before I spend my money with you. You can send a mixed message by having reissues take place, because you lead to folks not buying it at release because there is a problem, or even if there's not a problem, they choose not to buy it because they don't know if there's going to be a problem. They're not buying it because they're afraid of the quality that the figure is ultimately going to be in. And honestly, this is an example that applies to me with the Teen Gohan that recently came out. Gohan's my favorite Dragon Ball character, and that version of Teen Gohan is the pinnacle of Gohan as a whole, I would say. So that's a figure that I would be primed for picking up. However, because of QC issues as a whole, I waited a little bit, and sure enough, that's been a figure that's been identified as having a big problem with one of the, I think it's the right hip, that snaps if you move it too far and you don't have it loose enough at that point. So that's an example of where me personally, I'm gonna probably wait and hope that there's gonna be a reissue. Maybe there won't be, maybe there will be, who knows, but because of the condition that the original figure's in, I'm right now not gonna buy it because that's not the representation of Gohan that I want. And as I said, sometimes that can send a mixed message like, oh, they're not gonna support a Gohan figure. No, I really would, and I really enjoy Gohan as a character, but because of the condition he was released in, I'm holding off for now. So those are just kind of my thoughts as a whole in general. As mentioned, not trying to be negative, but it does seem like we've gotten a lot of reissues recently, and there's been QC discussions that have taken place. So those are just some of the pros and cons I listed of doing reissues. Overall, as a whole, great to do to correct the wrongs as you did, but it'd be great to not have those wrongs take place in the first place, is my general summary of my thoughts on this. So what are your thoughts? Do you think reissues are beneficial to have? Is it become too many at some point? Have reissues impacted your buying decisions? We'd love to see your comments down below and just get your feedback as a whole. Appreciate you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.